want to take some time away from the game and talk more about economic development in the 19th century and early 20th century. Now, the early 20th century is where we're going to see the best data and information. The 19th century, obviously, the further back we go, the sketchier the data is because methods of collection were not really nationalized. They didn't see a need for it. But as industrialization progressed, so the need to categorize and quantify and so forth. Now, what I have here, this is a chart from courtesy of the Dallas Federal Reserve, and it shows the percentage of different sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. What percentage of the working population was involved in those in the USA from 1800 to 2000? If you're looking for 2000, it's about here on my shirt, going up from there. But for purposes of the game, I've got the vertical lines going from 1830 to 1940, every 10 years, and the horizontal lines are every 10% from 20% up to 80%. Now, this chart is actually typical of economies during this time period, not just the USA, but England, France, Germany. Any industrializing economy looks something like this. Now, economies that industrialized later on, such as Japan, Russia, even China, they have the same kind of expansion. It's just shifted to the right in terms of which year it is, but they still have the same very large agriculture sector that erodes pretty steadily over time. The industrial sector that grows to about 30 to 35% and then holds constant for a few decades and then begins to shrink. And you can see that shrinkage happening right around here. And no, that's not because of any decline in actual industrial output. It's actually, we're going to see industrial output really takes off. But it's in terms of productivity per worker. Just as you see the farm population just going down to, it's like less than 2% or so. It's very small nowadays, and it used to be 90% back in 1800. Manufacturing population, as we were saying, has gone from 30% down to 15%. Services takes up the rest. But again, during this time period, this is where we see the emergence of the service economy. And by the time we get to 1936, we're just at the verge of where we see the service economy exceed that of the industrial sector, but it doesn't yet exceed that of the industrial plus the agricultural sector. That's going to come later on, where we actually cross over around somewhere in the late 50s, right around that time, right around 1960. That's where services are going to be more than 50% of the workforce, and it continues to increase from there. To make more sense of this, let's take a look at some actual numbers on these. So I'm going to zoom in because the spreadsheet I made, along with the other graphic, they died when my computer crashed last night and doing some other testing. But I had made screenshots, so I was discussing with another modder. And if you're wondering who the modder was, the name is Ascending Phoenix. He's the one that's given us the technology expanded, text expanded mod. And he and I are looking at what we can do with technology in the game Victoria 3 to get more of this in the game. All right. So anyway, we looked at the populations, and I've got another game running here. I'll just show you that I am in fact running this game here. I have it paused on December 16th of 1911, so I can come back to it if I need to. But yeah, I've got the game paused there. So I can say, yeah, we should be about here. And I'm checking around the world, and I do actually see the population's roughly a third of the population in each sector. That makes sense. But what's not making sense is what they're doing with that sector. Let me explain here. If we look at between 1900 and 1910 in the USA, we have the percentage of the farm population go from 45 to 37%. The total population go from 76 to 92%, but the total farm population, the percentage may have dropped, but the total number stays constant at 34 million, give or take 100,000. The industrial population remains 30% of the population, but it goes from 22 to 27%. So the percent stays the same, but the population grows, and the service population, that really takes off, 19 million to 30 million. And we see it's actually passing up the industrial population. And then this 1920 number is skewed because of World War One. That's where, because we had to have a lot more industrial population, so that's why it pulls even with the service population. And then after that, farming and industrial populations are in a somewhat of a decline, and the service population is in somewhat of an increase. Okay. Now, but we see these numbers here. What does this all mean? Well, we're not seeing huge switches from decade to decade in terms of employment. But when we look at in terms of output, keep in mind that the number of farmers here from 1870 to 1930, or let's say 1920, because that's I got a chart there I'm going to show you. 1870 to 1920, we add 11 million farmers. So that's like a 50% increase in the total number of farmers. So if we saw a 50% increase in acres farmed and a 50% increase in output total, that would make sense. But we know they're also becoming more efficient. So if we see more output per acre, perhaps that would account for it. So let's take a look. This is from the 1921 yearbook, agricultural yearbook from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we see this is covering 1870 is here. We've got 20 million acres under farming. And let's say 1920, 21, this is after World War I is over. We got 60 million. We'll ignore the spike. We'll take the spot here because that makes a more even graph. So triple the number of acres under cultivation. Triple. But we've only increased the workforce by 50%. We've increased the number of acres under production by 300%, and we've increased the workforce by 50%. So that means from 1870 to 1920, if let's say we have 10 workers in 1870 and they're working 20 acres, okay, so that's 2 acres per worker there. Well, we would have then 15 workers in 1920 working 60 acres. So that's 4 acres per worker. So we're doubling the number of acres per worker between 1870 and 1920. And actually, the real numbers are like 1.25 and 2.5 or something. But it really is a doubling the number of acres each worker works. So that's one area there. That means they're more productive in what they're doing. And when we look at yield per acre, we're going from about 12 bushels per acre to about 15 bushels per acre. These are 10-year running averages. Obviously, you see the year on year, and they can swing wildly, and we certainly don't have that yet in the game, but that's another area of discussion. But definitely, this is only a 25% increase. So we've tripled the number of, we've increased the productivity per acre by 25%, tripled the number of acres under cultivation, and we've increased the total farm workforce by about 50%. And if we look at production, here again in 1870 we make about 250 million bushels, and we're just north of 750 million here. We've tripled the number of acres under cultivation, or tripled the output here. And we've also tripled the number of acres under cultivation. I think the acres under cultivation has something to do with it, but the fact that we've also essentially doubled the number of acres that a worker can work. In Victoria 3 terms, take a farm and cut its labor force in half, and it's still as productive as it was before. That's what we should be seeing. That's what we should be seeing. Dramatic reductions in the farm workforce per agricultural unit. And and then continued output increases, steady output increases over the decades, just to add icing to that cake. And that's an agricultural output. Let's take a look at industrial. Whoa, that's a big graph. All right. Now, we've got here a dip for right after 1920. There was a very severe recession in the US. And of course, we have the Great Depression here. So let's disregard those somewhat. And we do have World War II here, and then the 1950s, and then the 1960s. And we're making tons of cars. And here's the 70s going into, oh no, the 80s. We had a recession there. And American manufacturing shifted tremendously, but away from steel and more to plastics, things like that. And if you remember the population percentages, if we could focus here on, let's go down here to the bottom. We're just really interested in this part, 1900 to 1930. That's where we see the game. And ignore the dip here for the recession. We can see, we get a pretty straight line approximation here that in 1900 we've got about 10 million tons of steel and 20 million tons of iron being produced in the US. And we go over here to 1930, we've got about 40 million tons of steel. That's 4 times the output. And we've got, let's say, 70 million tons of iron, about triple the output there. So that's 1900 to 1930. 4 times or triple the output. We'll go with triple the output there. Are we actually tripling the number of workers? 1900 to 1930. 1900 we have 22 million industrial workers. In 1930 we have 36 million. We've added another 14 million workers. Looking at 22 is almost 21, so 66% more. You know, 66% of the total workforce in 1900 we've added again. So a 66% increase in workforce, but we've got a 300% increase in output minimum. That is not reflected in the game. Because if I was to take you to the game right now, and I know it's 1910 here, but if we remember, go here back to 1900. All right, go back down here to 1900, 10 million tons. 1910, we're at 20 million, 22 million. We should be doubling that output at least in steel. Okay, in just those 10 years, I come back to Victoria 3, and I look at this German empire, look at the German market, look at its steel production. There it is, steel right there. You can't see it off the side, but that is a steel. And as the number one producer in the world, it is making 18.9 thousand units of steel. I know it's in the middle of a war here, but it's still producing a lot of steel. And, well, 10 years ago, it was making only 19,000. It was about the same amount there. Same for England, same for France, same for the USA. 10 years ago, when I checked it out, they were making roughly the same amount of steel that they're making in 1911. That means we are not seeing that huge leap, that huge jump in output. And that means that the labor force is weird. Because if we still have the same number of steel mills, because the method of steel production didn't change in this time period. The game kind of locks it down there. They haven't switched over to arc welding, even though they have electricity because they're not building generators. So the method of making steel has remained the same. And that means with the same output, they have the same number of workers, the same number of factories. This is not what we should be seeing. We should be seeing maybe more factories come online, maybe more workers get hired, but certainly, even if we don't hire more workers or make more factories, that output needs to be taken off big time. Because that 66% additional workers that we added, they didn't suddenly figure out, oh my gosh, you guys are making steel all wrong. Here's how you do it. They were doing it the same way everybody else was, and they were improving alongside with them. It's the technology and the efficiency that should be getting us those benefits. And we don't see it here. And the result is, if we look back here in Germany, let's go to German Empire, let's go to census data. All right. Looking at only unemployed, there are 43,000 unemployed persons in the German Empire. And if we look at everybody, including the peasants, we've got 41,000 peasants. 41,000 peasants, 43,000 unemployed. And if we look at the peasants, where are they located? They're mostly in Greenland, as we see here. I know. So almost your entire peasant population is in Greenland. They all have work. Let's just go ahead and go back to see all. And for our unemployment, yeah, we've got a big chunk of bureaucrats in Schleswig-Holstein. That's our biggest chunk of unemployed. And then everybody else, it's much smaller. 43,000 people unemployed out of 55.7 million labor force. No, even in wartime, that's ridiculously low numbers. And I've checked with other economies, they're in the same boat. So what needs to happen? Okay, I would say it's a kludge, but we've got to start squeezing the factories. That as we improve technology, the factory population per factory must go into decline while the output is increasing. That will produce more people to do more stuff. The factory is more like, if my factory is going to be 300% more productive with 66% more workers, well, what if I have only 0% more workers? It could still be maybe 200% more productive, 150% more productive. I don't know how much more it's going to be, but just by improving the technology and keeping my workforce constant, I'm going to make more steel, make more tools. And so to figure that into the game, because if you tell the game, well, just keep the 5,000 people in this factory constant, change their classifications, make fewer laborers and more machinists, or fewer machinists and more engineers, increase the qualifications so they get paid more. Well, let's just also just decrease those jobs overall. Yeah, we don't have as many labor jobs, not because we moved them to other areas, it's because we just removed them completely. Now they've got other things to do. They've got to find a job. We keep about 2%, 3%, up to 5, 6, 7%. That's actually stable unemployment if you in economic terms, and I'll get into that in another video, I'm sure. But we've got to have it where over time we're squeezing the factories with better technology and increasing output. So that way we have more opportunity to build other things like car factories, radio factories. Because if we look at that, I need to go to France for this one, because France has actually made a radio. Well, they had one earlier. They had a factory in Gotaland. They had a factory there. Look, they made .09 radios. This is 1911. There should be, especially in a wartime, there should be loads of radios getting made for the navies and armies and things like that. But they're not. And automobile production is low globally. There's a bunch being, no, that's artillery. I meant automobile. Where's that? There we go. A bunch of cars being made in Ulster. So apparently there's a DeLorean factory, and there's a bunch of automobiles being made in Sweden. So we got the Saabs, but yeah, that's it. Got some Ferraris here. That's it. That's all we got there. There's very little else being made. No Detroit here. There's no Ford Motor Company. There should be one, but anyway. So we're out of it. How do we get car factories going? Honestly, it's either at a factory or at an event or at a journal or something, or at a corporation. Get something going. It may just be because they don't have enough people. Remember, we've only got 55,000 unemployed in Germany. We've only got 70,000 unemployed in the USA. Just tiny, tiny numbers of unemployed globally. They don't have a workforce to pull in to get these new industries going off the ground. That's why you want stable unemployment. A certain amount of people are always there being a certain number unemployed so that they're available for new jobs in new industries as they're expanding. As you squeeze the old ones, the new ones can pick up more people. But then those get squeezed over time and you add more people to do other things. You can open up new factories because you've got more people, because you've squeezed the ones you have. With the better technology, you'll have better production. Now, this is going to work great for Europe and the United States. It's going to be absolutely bonkers in China, especially if Qing industrializes. However they do it, if they industrialize or India industrializes, then because their arable land is also way off. It's the Jiangxi, which is the size of Kansas, which has about a quarter of the, or a fifth of the total arable land that Kansas has in the game, has got more than double the number of agricultural plots that Kansas does. This is, but they did it so that way China wouldn't starve if it was 100% on subsistence farming. Anyway, that's got to get worked over somehow. Either I don't know. Like I said, we're working on this with what we can do with technology, and the first thing we're going to look at is just increasing the output per factory. The next thing, even though it's not really realistic, it's got to be squeezing the factories just to create more workers available to do other jobs. And then the third thing would probably be do something to get car and radio production off the ground, to not make it where you have these huge surpluses of tools globally. Because, I mean, if I take you to the USA, they're not even the largest maker of tools. Go to the USA market, go down to tools, here we are. Yeah, they're 5,000 tools extra, and they're only the number 3 producer. And they've got 5,000 extra. No. And there's like 10,000 here, 6,000 there, 7,000 here. Everybody be making tools and nobody's making cars. And those tool industries are soaking up steel and workers and other things that could have been going towards a newer industry. So to recap, let's go back to the graphs. Steel and iron output, they've got to be increasing with the workforce not going up by as much. Technology needs to have much more impact, especially in the late part of the mid game and the entire part of the end game. Basically, the last 50 years of this game, we need to see technology going insane. That's number one. Number two, populations proportionally are going to decline for agriculture, rise and maintain for industrial, and slowly rise all the way through for service industries. And to do that, we've got to simulate it just by squeezing existing factories so that more get made. What does this do for pollution? Oh, it'll go insane. So obviously there's another mod that I want to work on that would just strip the pollution out of factories, because it's, as a mechanic, it's not really going to do anything. You're going to wind up with these places, if they that are, it'll be insane. So it's got to come down, because things need tinkering to make it make more sense. Because if we want to have this kind of production in Victoria 3 with this kind of population growth, we've got to have more unemployment. We've got to have more technology producing these things, and that's going to give us a much more realistic economy. So I hope you learned something about late 1800s, early 2000 or early 1900s, not 2000s, early 1900s industrialization, what it looked like, what it should look like, and what we hope to make it look like with the next mods that we come up with. Like, comment, subscribe. Make sure you donate to a charity that helps people stay alive. Be nice to other people, and we'll see you in the next video.